By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive beyond the proper time of life. There are those who have wondered why Sarah is included in the Bible's most famous chapter on faith. Her story, as it unfolds in the book of Genesis, seems to be a story of disbelief. It seems to be a story of personal manipulation. If you are familiar with her life, then you will remember that God promised to give to her husband Abraham a son. Now, a promise like that may perhaps seem glib because children are born every day. But any story, if it is an attention-grabbing story, has what is called a point of tension around which everything revolves. The point of tension in the story of Abraham and Sarah is that Sarah, while God promised to give her a son, Sarah was barren. Now, most women are as fertile as the day is long. My mom was one of those women. From 1951 to 1959, my mom gave birth to 5 children. During those years, the common phrase in our extended family went like this: well, Bobby is pregnant again. Well, I was the second of those children, the first of 3 boys, sandwiched between 2 daughters. Now, my wife Donna was a lot like my mom. Every time we decided to have a child, within a month, Donna became pregnant. She gave birth to 3 children, and she would like to have had more, but 3 cesarean sections rendered her womb too weak to endure the stress of further pregnancies. Sarah was not like my mom. Sarah was not like my wife. Sarah had been barren all of her life, and she showed no signs of fertility. More than anything in her life, she wanted to give her husband that promised son. I can imagine that she spent innumerable sleepless nights in which she wept silently for hours and cried out to God in anguish and pain. Surely she asked herself again and again and again what she had done to deserve a womb that would not produce a child. In those days, a woman who could not have children was considered to be cursed by God. She was considered to be under divine punishment. Well, so much did Sarah want to have a son that she finally suggested to her husband Abraham that the promised child could be produced through her maid Hagar. Now, such a suggestion sort of comes as a shock to us, but it was not uncommon in the ancient world for a barren wife to have children through her personal servant. Now, this is how it would work. The husband would impregnate his wife's maid. The maid, having become pregnant, while giving birth, would literally sit upon the lap of her mistress so that it could be said that the child sprang forth from the loins of the mistress. Now, had you been Sarah's counselor in those days, you might well have concurred with her plan. I mean, in the ancient world, an effort like that was common. But in addition, while God had specifically promised that this son would come from Abraham's own body, he mentioned nothing at first about Sarah being the actual mother. And so since God had not given to her the ability to conceive, perhaps this was the way that God wanted to accomplish his will. It was perfectly logical. Well, while Sarah's plan may have been perfectly logical, it was also a plan that is characterized by every non-Christian religion in the world. Why? Here's the answer. Sarah's plan depended on human manipulation rather than the intervention of God. Sarah's plan depended on what Sarah could do, not on what God could do. Not one part of Sarah's plan needed God's help. Not one part of Sarah's plan necessitated action on the part of God. Everything this woman hoped to accomplish could be accomplished by the strength of human ingenuity and human flesh alone. Her plan did not fit into any part, or God did not fit into any part of the equation. So now we come to the sixth characteristic of faith. However, let's review the first five before we get going. Number one, moving, shaking faith requires us to live by information from God rather than information from our feelings. Number two, moving, shaking faith requires us to attempt that which is perceived to be beyond our ability. Third, moving, shaking faith requires an overwhelming desire to please God. Number four, moving, shaking faith requires us to do what we've never done before, perhaps something that no one's ever done before. Fifth, shaking, moving faith requires hearing what cannot be heard, following what cannot be known, and seeing what cannot be seen. So that brings us to characteristic number 6 of moving, shaking faith. And as I give this to you, let me remind you that characteristic 6 is as challenging as the first 5 put together. Well, here it is. Moving, shaking faith requires the intervention of God as opposed to the manipulation of man. Now, would living by faith be easier for you if angels made an appearance and said to you what God was going to do? Well, not so for Sarah. In Genesis chapter 18, 3 angels visited Sarah and told her that before the passage of another 12 months, that she from her own body would give birth to a son. When she heard that, she laughed in utter disbelief. Well, why? Simple. Even if she had not been barren in Genesis chapters 15, 16, and 17, she was far beyond the childbearing years by the time of Genesis 18, when she was almost 90 years of age. Do you know any 90-year-old women who've had a baby lately? Anybody want to stand and give a testimony? Do you know any 90-year-old women who even want to have a baby? What's more, Abraham, who had possession of his virility in his earlier years when he impregnated Hagar, by chapter 18, he had lost the ability to sire children. He was 1 year shy of 100 years of age at that time. And Hebrews 11:12 says that in terms of sexual ability, Abraham was as good as dead. There was nothing there. It was gone. While God had in fact made the promise to Abraham and Sarah to give them a son who would come from their own bodies, he in fact removed every possibility of personal ability and human manipulation before he fulfilled that promise. This was not only true for Sarah, it was also true for Abraham. I see way back in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham had been willing to accept his manservant Eliezer as the child of promise. And in Genesis 17, he expressed his willingness to settle for Ishmael. His child by Hagar is the child of promise. But God said no to Eliezer, and God said no to both those requests, including Ishmael. Abraham was willing to settle for less than God's best. And it is intriguing to me that still today we are willing to settle for less than God's best. We are usually satisfied to take less than what God wants to actually give us. And I think the reason is found in at least three answers. Number one, we are willing to settle for less than God's best because we are short-sighted. You know, the thing that most of us see is what is right in front of us. God, on the other hand, sees far down the road. Unfortunately, we fail to ask for God's vision. We fail to see through His eyes. Esau, one of Abraham's grandchildren, was willing to settle for less than God's best when he traded his birthright for a bowl of stew. Genesis 25 tells the story. Esau's physical hunger meant more to him than spiritual treasure. Esau was a man who lived only for the moment. And when at last he came around to a higher way of thinking, it was too late. The birthright was gone. Did you know that minor children cannot sign legal documents? And even if they were to sign some kind of legal document, the terms of the agreement could not be enforced. Why? Here's why. Because children do not have the ability to think in terms of the distant future. Like Esau, they live only for the present moment. They can see only what is in front of them. Well, we can be short-sighted as well, can't we? We may not be children, but when it comes to many of life's decisions and judgments, we fail to see the big picture. That's why seeing through God's eyes is critical. He sees the end from the beginning. Those people who challenge their world and change their world settle for nothing less than God's best. There's another reason we'll settle for less than God's best, and it is because we are impatient. We know what we want, and we want it when? Now. We want it right now. Impatience is what kept the Old Testament character Samson in trouble. His story starts out in Judges 14 like this. Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Now his mom and dad tried to discourage him. Samson, think about something. That woman is not an Israelite. That woman has no idea about spiritual concerns. Samson, be more patient. But Samson would not listen. He said in verse 3, get her for me, for she looks good to me. Okay, I'm there. I can feel that. And Samson got her. But it wasn't long that this Philistine woman betrayed him. The writer of Judges says that other men plowed with Samson's heifer, and it cost him dearly. Now, is there anything wrong with marriage? Absolutely not. Is there anything wrong with marrying a good-looking woman? No! I married a good-looking woman, and I'm glad I married a good-looking woman. We've been married 38 and a half years, almost 39 years, and she's still a good-looking woman. On last Friday, was it last Friday? We went to the beach and got out there about 5 o'clock. We were going to stay until the sun set, and it just so happened that just down the beach from us on Honeymoon Island, they had set up chairs and what do you call that thing? An archway? What is that called? Huh? Cabana? Yeah, something like that. And so after the wedding was done, Donna wanted to go down there, and through that cabana, archway, what did you call it? Arbor, that thingamajig that they use in weddings. And she wanted to take a picture of the sunset through the arbor. Of course, I do what I do at the beach. I sat in my chair while she went down to do that. I don't go to the beach to walk. Oh, I love walking at the beach. Not me. I don't go to the beach to walk. I go to the beach to sit. Donna goes down to take a picture. While she's down there, one of the state workers is putting up the chairs and things that had been set up for the wedding. He is right there where Donna is, and he says to her, "You are a good-looking woman." You know, you got a good-looking woman, you got to keep a leash on her all the time. I mean, she's just down there taking pictures, and she's being hit on. She is a good-looking woman. Nothing wrong with that. However, there is something terribly wrong when impatience causes us to make the wrong decision and to take the wrong action. Impatience has cost many of us more than we would care to discuss. Impatience has forced many of us to settle for less than God's best. But we didn't realize it until it was too late. Many teenagers are more than anxious to take on a huge array of experiences in life. But they sometimes miss out on the most wonderful opportunities of youth through a disregard for timing. Years ago, I was a minister of music and youth in a church in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. While I served there, a particular girl, 16, 17 years of age, joined our church, and she had a magnificent soprano voice, as beautiful and as pure as I have ever heard. And I don't want to reveal her name, but let's just call her Jody. By the way, there's nobody here named Jody, right? I'm not gonna step on anybody's feelings here. Jody loved the Lord deeply. And she wanted God to use her voice for His glory. And He did. However, Jody also wanted to get married, which is what most women in Alabama want. She wanted to get married. Now, that's not normally a problem, except this girl, she was not unattractive, but she was not attractive, and she had never even been asked for a date. She wanted to get married, but she thought to herself, that will never happen for me. Well, a young man eventually came along who wanted to marry Jody. Unfortunately, he was not a Christian. He had absolutely no intention of becoming a Christian, and in fact, he was headed in the opposite direction of Christianity, and he wanted to take Jody with him. So she approached me about performing their wedding ceremony, and I refused. In the conversation, I related in as loving a way as I could that I simply did not want to be a part of an event that would ultimately work for her destruction. Less than a year later, Jody was back in my office weeping over the decision that she had made so carelessly. Instead of patiently waiting on the right man, she lived only for the moment. She couldn't believe somebody came along who wanted to marry her. Couldn't believe anybody else would come along who would want to marry her. She was so anxious to obtain what was in front of her that she settled for less than God's best. Well, in like fashion, many young adults are drowning in debt because they are impatient to have all the things now that their parents took decades to obtain. Many men and women anxious to climb the corporate ladder as quickly as possible have no real idea of what makes life rich because they are so focused on the rapid attainment of wealth and position. You know, is there anything wrong with wanting to experience all that life has to offer? Absolutely not. But listen to this. Timing is as important as any experience you might want to have. In fact, timing is what usually makes the difference between an experience that is full and an experience that ultimately produces heartache. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 3, there is an appointed time for everything. Put that up on the screen. Put that up on the screen. They'll get there in a minute. See, life is not supposed to be a roll of the dice. Fullness of life is not arbitrarily obtained. An ordered, prayerful, seasonal approach produces far greater satisfaction than impatience could ever do. But we are willing to settle for less than God's best, sometimes because we are short-sighted, and sometimes because we are impatient, and then sometimes because we are arrogant. Now, what does that mean? When a person is arrogant, that person thinks that he or she knows better than God knows. When we become arrogant, we think that we are better at plotting out and planning life than God is. Have you ever thought that? Have you ever thought to yourself, God, you don't know what you're doing. Lord, I've got everything written down here on my pad, on my bucket list. Now, Lord, you just take a look at that and get busy. We sort of do God that way, don't we? Even if we don't actually write something out, we think of that. It was Job who thought he knew better than God, who wanted actually to take God to court and put God on trial. And in the end, Job said this, I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I will ask you, and you will instruct me. Have you reached the point where you are willing to ask God and allow Him to instruct you? What a difference that makes in living. You want a life that makes sense. Ask God to instruct you in every scenario and experience. Take a look with me at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. Solomon writes some tremendous words here. Do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and men. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. Have you walked any crooked paths lately that have caused you pain? Look at verse 7. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. Turn from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. I love the words healing and refreshment. They remind me of the words of Jesus, said, come to me and I will cause to spring up from your innermost being rivers of living water. Isn't that the kind of life that you want? Verse 9, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of your produce. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. Now, if I were going to divide the book of Proverbs into paragraphs, and these 10 verses form one paragraph, then I would entitle this paragraph, Life at its Best. Now, I've prepared a list from Life at its Best. I put the principle on one side, the result on the right side. So let's take a look at that. Here's principle number 1. Prioritizing God's teaching. Here's the result. Length of days, long life, and Solomon adds peace. Prioritize the teachings of God. That's what you're going to get. Principle number 2, kindness and truth. What is the result? Favor and respect. Look at principle number 3. Acknowledging God's ways. What's the result? Walking straight paths. Here's principle number 4. Leaning on God's wisdom. Here's the result. Healing and refreshment. Here's number 5. Honoring God with your wealth. Please notice the result. Abundantly supplied resources. Wow. That's life at its best. And you cannot beat that. Does that mean you will never have to trust God with your finances? No, I have to trust God with my finances all the time. And sometimes I get pretty pressed about it. And you know what? Like a person deficient in faith, I'll go to the Lord and say, Lord, don't you think I need to cut back on this giving a little bit? And invariably, He impresses upon me this. Not only do I not want you to cut back, I want you to give more. Wow. It is amazing how we give more and in some way have more. That's the promise of God. Now, if you agree with me that Solomon's words are life at its best, then also understand this. This kind of life is built with patience, it is built with humility, and it is built with seeing the big picture. If you are trying to hurry things along, if you are trying to scheme your way to the top, then that is called living a life of arrogance. And a life of arrogance never reaches life at its best. Now listen to what I'm about to tell you. God does not need, nor does He accept human scheming and ingenuity. He does not. Abraham and Sarah struggled with short-sightedness. They struggled with impatience. They struggled with arrogance. At some point, however, both Abraham and Sarah stopped depending on what they thought and on what they could do and on what they could figure out, and they started depending on what God thought and what God could do and what God could figure out. Romans chapter 4 verse 18 calls it hope against hope. And sometimes we feel that way. But somewhere along the line, Abraham and Sarah began trusting not just in the promise of God, but in the ability of God to deliver upon His promise without the help of human hands. How often in our lives have we made some decision or attempted some project and the mark of God was nowhere to be found? Our mark was on it. Our ability was the apparatus. We made it come to pass. Now, am I telling you that the Christian is never to act? No, I'm not telling you that. God's children are not to be pacifists. God does call us to action, but knowing when to act and how God wants us to act is critical. We have our part to accomplish, but our part is never to take the place of God's part. Now let me show you something. When Abraham and Sarah took things into their own hands, this was the result. The rise of conflict in the Middle East, and that conflict continues right into the 21st century. And it will keep going until Jesus comes again. That started when Abraham and Sarah tried to manipulate and scheme their way to the will of God. When Isaac's wife Rebekah took things into her own hands, she wanted her favorite son Jacob to receive the blessing and the birthright instead of Isaac's favorite son Esau getting the blessing and the birthright, which traditionally belonged to Isaac anyway. So Rebekah took it upon herself, brought in her son Jacob on the scheme, and said, "You're going to get that birthright and that blessing." What was the result? The division of a family, the hatred between two sons, and the loss of the son Rebekah wanted to exalt. She never saw him again. Well, how was God going to give him the birthright? We know God wanted him to have it. I do not know. Rebekah never gave God that chance. She instead took it upon herself to make it happen. When Moses took things into his own hands to deliver the children of Israel from the clutches of Egypt, God wanted it to happen, but Moses did not wait. He tried to scheme and manipulate his way into making it happen. What was the result? The murder of an Egyptian official and 40 years of living as a fugitive. That's what happened. 40 more years of Israel in slavery. That's what happened. When King David took things into his own hands, what was the result? An illicit affair, the murder of a brave, loyal soldier, the death of a child, personal humiliation before all of Israel, and running for his life. That was the result. Now, we started by asking why the writer of Hebrews included Sarah as an illustration of moving, shaking faith. And perhaps he did so for three reasons. Number one, to illustrate God's patience and God's determination in regard to his children. Here's number two. To demonstrate that there is hope for those people who have struggled for years to see God, to believe God for some great thing. And then number three, to encourage us that when faith finally wins out over short-sightedness and impatience and arrogance, that even we become witness to the doing of the undoable. You know, I may be wrong in this, but I really believe that this is what happened before God brought me and Donna here. And any of you remember how long you were without a pastor? How long? Should any church go 2.5 years without a pastor? Is it any church? How many of you said to yourself, what is that blankety blank pastor search committee doing? Anybody say that? Huh? What is going on? I'm going to call them, give them a piece of my mind. Anybody ever think that? We just need to get somebody else. 2.5 years. But guess what? God kept his promise. God kept his promise. Donna and I believe that, or we wouldn't be here today. You know, when God first gave to Abraham the promise of a son, you know how old Abraham was? He was 70. His wife Sarah was 60. Do you know how many years passed before the fruition of the promise? 30 years. Most people I know would have given up after 3 months. They would have given up after 3 years. 30 years. Abraham and Sarah struggled during that time. And they kept messing up. But when they finally came around to believing the promise of God and waiting on him, magnificent things happen. Did you know that's really the crux of the Christian life? We live by the promises of God. We trust God for those promises, and we actuate our lives according to those promises, and then we believe God to get done whatever it is he wants done. Did you know that's what the Christian life is? This is what Sarah struggled with. This is what Abraham struggled with. This is what we struggle with. But God kept working. God kept moving. And so what, as we cross that bridge, does God want us to do today? He wants us never to give up. Never stop trusting. Never sell God short. Never sell yourself short. God always keeps his promises, and I mean always. Just because he doesn't keep them the way we want them to doesn't mean God is not working. And because he doesn't answer in the timing we want him to answer in, we think God is not working. And what do? We mess up our lives. Anybody in here ever messed up their life? Anybody? Is it just me? Yeah. Folks, you want to be a mover and a shaker? You want the power to challenge and change your world? Then you see the big picture. You live by the promises of God. And if he tells you to act, you act. But until he tells you to act, you don't move one muscle. And I don't care how long it's been. You trust him to get it done. I got to tell you, I've been in ministry for over 40 years. And when I left Shorter University and started driving a bus, and when I was just a part-time pastor and saying, why God? I got no answer from him. Because I already knew why. Just keep doing what you know is right. And when it's time, I'm going to turn you loose. But see, as old as I was, I shouldn't have to wait anymore. I shouldn't have to trust God to move anymore. He just ought to move when I want him to move. But God doesn't do that. Let me tell you something, folks. Even I have to live like we're talking about today. Because I'm just a guy who wants desperately to live by the promises of God and yet sometimes struggles with the promises of God. But when I live by those promises and trust God, eventually, ultimately, and always good things happen. Do you believe that? Can you imagine how your workplace would change if in your workplace you just lived and trusted God for his promises? In your marriage, with your neighbor, with your children, with your finances. I mean, whatever it is. But we are willing to settle for less than the best. God says, no. I want you to have the best. Don't give up. Keep trusting. Keep believing. Keep following. Keep doing what is right. And you will not regret it.